Inside of St George's Chapel within the walls of Windsor Castle, there are two of the most notorious kings in history buried right next to each other. There is little that marks the burial place of these tyrants, except a simple marble slab. They were not given an elaborate tomb, and neither of them are given huge monuments to their reigns, but King Henry VIII is buried next to the executed King Charles I, the man who lost the English Civil War, and also lost his head in London in 1649. Charles I's burial was kept secret for many centuries and years, and Parliament had good reason to conceal the burial, as they feared that the king's bones and remains could be dug up and actually worshipped as a relic for the royalist cause. King Charles I was not allowed to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey with his father, the first Stuart monarch, and also his grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots, but was permitted to be buried in Windsor alongside many other kings and queens. But why is King Charles I buried next to King Henry VIII? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The burial vault that today contains the remains of the two kings was never intended to hold anyone but King Henry VIII and his third wife Jane Seymour. But it was not intended to hold their coffins for very long, as Henry VIII dreamed of being interred inside a huge tomb and monument, presumably inside of Westminster Abbey. When Jane Seymour died following childbirth in October 1537, Henry VIII ordered her to be buried inside of a vault directly under the choir of St George's Chapel in Windsor. Because of this, a small vault was excavated, and at the time it was considered that Henry may also want to be buried there too. So space was also made for the Tudor monarch, the king, but following Henry's death in 1547, the king was interred alongside Jane Seymour. There are disputes about the state of the coffin when it was placed inside of the vault, as there are some stories about the king's coffin becoming splintered due to an explosion during the funeral procession, which occurred because of an expulsion of gas from his corpse. But Henry's coffin was left for some time alongside Jane Seymour's, until the execution of King Charles I. The burial vault itself was very small, and was certainly not intended to contain the remains of more than two people, and because of this, following the execution of this Stuart king, work was actually performed inside of the vault, moving Henry's coffin to the side, and also during this it was claimed that the trestle holding it broke, and space was then made to inter King Charles I. Parliament had a huge problem. As mentioned, they wanted the king's remains disposing of quietly, and they didn't want him to have a huge funeral, regarding this as trouble and ammunition for the royalists, and they were also fearful that his corpse would be dug up and then later used as a royalist relic. It was stated that Parliament allowed the burial of King Charles I inside of St George's Chapel on the basis that he should be privately carried to Windsor without pomp or noise. This would not be a funeral procession that would attract attention, but it was believed that the final journey, taking the king's body from central London to Windsor Castle, was attended on by what was referred to as a number of gentlemen. On the 7th of February 1649, the body of King Charles I was taken to the Dean's house in St George's Chapel and in Windsor, and it was allegedly covered in black cloth before it was carried to the executed king's former bedchambers within the castle. It was claimed that Charles's body was, that night, placed in that chamber, which usually had been his bedchamber. The next morning it was carried into the Great Dean's Hall, where it lay in state and remained until the Lords came, who arrived in the afternoon. St George's Hall in Windsor Castle had been prepared by being hung with black cloth, and it was certainly a quiet ceremony burying King Charles I. There has been some rumour that the initial burial place for King Charles may have actually been in the same vault as King Edward IV, the Yorkist king, but the decision was then made to inter him in the centre of the choir, with Henry VIII very, very quietly. The coffin of King Charles was covered in black cloth, and it was taken from the Dean's Hall to St George's Chapel on the 9th of February, a few days after it had arrived. It was claimed that it was carried by gentlemen of quality who were in mourning, and forming the cortege were noblemen, the governor of Windsor Castle, further gentlemen, officers and attendants who followed the coffin into the chapel. It was claimed that as the coffin made its way, it began to snow, and the snow fell so fast that by the time the corpse came to the west end of the royal chapel, the black velvet pall was all white, the colour of innocence, being thickly covered with snow. Parliament may have approved using St George's Chapel and Windsor as a place for the executed king's burial, as it was being utilised at the time by Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell to imprison and house prominent royalists who had been captured. Charles I had also been locked up here himself before his trial took place, and the garrison of soldiers based at the castle and around the city would keep the remains of the king safe and would prevent a grave robbing as it was staffed around the city. Charles I was buried in secret, and it would be in the early 19th century that the remains of Charles I were found once and for all. The search was led by Sir Henry Halford, and he was looking for the king's remains, as they had been missing for so long. He had previously looked into Westminster Abbey as a possible site of burial, and he then turned to St George's Chapel, and in 1813 he discovered Charles I's remains inside the same burial vault that they had been interred nearly 200 years before. In the presence of the future King George IV, the coffin of King Charles I was then opened. It was said of this, and I quote, "It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it is also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead, and eye, and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and then held to view. It was quite wet and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen when it touched. With this Halford is referring to him literally holding up the head of King Charles I. He continues, "The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when they are soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. On holding up the head to examine the further place of separation from the body, the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the substances of the divided portions perfectly smooth and even, an appearance which could have been only produced by a heavy blow, inflicted with a very sharp instrument, and which furnished a last proof wanting to identify King Charles I. The coffin of King Charles I had been opened, and the decision was then made to seal the coffin and to not examine the body below the neck. It's believed that this was the last time that Henry VIII and Charles I's vault has been opened. The burial was kept secret for some time, with the coffin lost to time, before it was discovered almost 200 years later. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.